The article appeared in Ebony magazine in 1955, and the jazz world read it with the particular attention reserved for things that feel like declarations of war. Miles Davis, 29 years old, the trumpet prodigy from East St. Louis, whose cool modal innovations were redefining what jazz could be, was not subtle. Louis Armstrong, he told the interviewer, is an Uncle Tom. He grins too much. He plays to the white audience. He doesn't represent what we're doing, what black music has become. He's a remnant of a time we should be moving past. The words landed with the weight of a generational verdict. A young black genius calling the old black genius a sellout. A revolutionary accusing an institution of collaboration. The bebop generation finally putting on the record what many of them had been saying privately, that Louis Armstrong's smiling, crowd-pleasing style was no longer acceptable as representation of black artistry, was in fact a betrayal of it. Louis Armstrong read the article, and his response, measured, sharp, historically grounded, and ultimately unanswerable in the way that lived experience is always unanswerable by theory, revealed the chasm between two men who were both right and both wrong in ways that the jazz world is still arguing about 7 decades later. This is the story of that confrontation. Not just a music industry dispute, a fundamental argument about what black artists owe their community, what survival costs, what resistance looks like, and whether a smile in the face of racism is accommodation or armor. Miles Davis and Louis Armstrong represented more than different musical approaches. They represented different theories of black survival in white America. Louis' theory had been forged in New Orleans in the early 1900s, refined through decades of navigating a music industry controlled entirely by white men, tested in concert halls where he couldn't use the front entrance but could sell out every seat. It was a theory of strategic accommodation. Give white audiences what they want emotionally, make yourself indispensable, build power through excellence rather than confrontation, and use that power carefully when it actually matters. It was the theory of a man who had watched what happened to black performers who made white audiences uncomfortable, who had seen careers destroyed by the wrong kind of defiance at the wrong moment. Miles Davis's theory had been forged in a different crucible. Born in 1926, 25 years after Louis, Miles grew up with the existence of successful black artists as a given rather than a revolutionary possibility. He attended Juilliard. He had a father who was a dentist, a middle-class background that gave him the psychological security to make demands that Louis had never been able to afford. He came of age during the bebop revolution, when Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie were deliberately making jazz too complex for casual white listeners, reclaiming the music as serious black art rather than entertainment for white consumption. Miles absorbed this ethos completely. Black artists didn't owe white audiences comfort. Black artists could turn their backs to the audience, refuse to announce song titles, dress like businessmen rather than performers. Black excellence didn't require white approval. Both theories were responses to the same underlying condition, American racism. Both were trying to solve the same problem: how does a black artist survive and create in a country that simultaneously wants your art and devalues your humanity? But they reached opposite conclusions. Louis said, manage the relationship carefully, find the space to be excellent within whatever constraints exist, build incrementally. Miles said, refuse to manage the relationship at all, assert your dignity unconditionally, make no accommodations. The argument between them wasn't about music, it was about how to be black in America. To understand why Miles's accusation hit so hard, you have to understand what Uncle Tom meant in 1955 Black America. The term derived from Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, where Uncle Tom was a black man who endured slavery with Christian patience and deference to white authority. By the mid-20th century, Uncle Tom had become shorthand for a black person who accommodated white racism rather than resisting it, who gained white approval by reinforcing rather than challenging racial hierarchy, who was more concerned with being acceptable to white people than loyal to black people. It was one of the most devastating accusations you could make in black American culture. It meant you had betrayed your own people for personal advancement. When Miles applied this label to Louis, he wasn't making a casual observation. He was making a specific indictment. The smile that audiences loved, the Satchmo persona, the entertainment style that included self-deprecating humor and exaggerated expressions, Miles read all of it as performance designed to make white audiences comfortable with a black man's genius, as minstrelsy updated for the modern era, as Louis playing a role that confirmed rather than challenged white expectations of how black men should present themselves, and there was evidence Miles could point to. Louis's manager Joe Glaser's entire strategy for Louis was built on mainstream crossover appeal, which meant Louis being non-threatening, broadly palatable, beloved rather than challenging. Louis performed for segregated audiences in the South well into the 1950s, accepting the humiliation of separate entrances and separate facilities as the price of access. Louis had been slow to speak out on civil rights, had maintained his smiling entertainer persona even as the Montgomery bus boycott and early civil rights confrontations demanded that black celebrities take sides. Miles could construct a compelling case from these facts, but Louis's response when it came was as devastating as the accusation, not defensive, not apologetic, grounded in an autobiography that Miles simply didn't have. I've been in places Miles has never been, Louis said in an interview later that year. I came up from nothing in New Orleans when they didn't just ignore you, they hurt you. I've had guns pointed at me. I've been told where I could sleep and where I couldn't. I played to black audiences in the South when the Klan would be outside the venue. I built something from nothing in a country that didn't want to let me. And I did it by being smart about when and how to push. Miles can afford to turn his back to the audience. I couldn't always do that. You survive however you survive, and then you use what you built to do something that matters. The Little Rock confrontation of 1957 was the exclamation point on Louis's rebuttal, when Louis publicly attacked President Eisenhower over the federal government's failure to protect black students in Little Rock. When he said the government can go to hell and canceled his State Department Soviet tour, he demonstrated that the smiling Satchmo was never the complete picture. Louis could turn the accommodating persona off when circumstances required it, could speak with exactly the kind of unambiguous political directness that Miles celebrated, and in doing so, could reach audiences that Miles's confrontational style never accessed. This was the complexity that Miles's Uncle Tom accusation couldn't accommodate. The same smile that Miles read as accommodation was also a tool. Louis's mainstream appeal, the goodwill he'd built with white audiences over decades, gave his political statements weight that musicians with purely black audiences couldn't generate. When Miles Davis criticized American racism, white America could dismiss it as expected, the angry young jazz musician saying predictable things. When Louis Armstrong said the government can go to hell, it landed like a bomb because it violated every expectation audiences had of him. The accommodating persona, whatever its costs, had created the conditions for maximum impact when Louis finally used his platform politically. But acknowledging this doesn't fully answer Miles's critique. Because the calculation Louis made, build mainstream appeal first, use it politically later, has costs that are more than personal. When black artists perform for white comfort, when they adopt personas designed to be non-threatening, they don't just affect their own careers. They contribute to a cultural landscape that tells black people their authentic selves are too much, need to be managed and softened and made palatable. Louis Armstrong's mainstream success was achieved partly through a performance style that confirmed certain white expectations about black entertainers. That's true regardless of how strategically he deployed it. The argument between Louis and Miles resonated through the jazz world in the 1950s and into the 1960s with specific musical stakes. As bebop and then modal jazz and then free jazz pushed increasingly away from entertainment and toward pure artistic expression, Louis's continued commitment to accessible, crowd-pleasing music felt to many younger musicians like aesthetic compromise. John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Charles Mingus, the avant-garde was interrogating every convention of jazz performance, and Louis's style represented conventions rather than their interrogation. For this generation, Louis Armstrong's music was background for white parties, not art. Louis was aware of how younger musicians saw him and was alternately dismissive and wounded by it. In public, he expressed confidence in his artistic choices, defended his approach as valid, noted that accessibility wasn't the same as mediocrity. In private recordings, in the tapes he made at home that nobody was meant to hear, there are passages where Louis's frustration with being seen as passé or compromised comes through. The man who had once been the absolute cutting edge of jazz innovation, who had changed what the instrument could do, who had transformed how improvisation worked, who had invented new ways of phrasing and timing that every subsequent trumpet player learned from, was now being dismissed by younger musicians as entertainment rather than art. That hurt. But there was also a class dimension to the Miles Davis critique that Louis seemed to understand even if he didn't always articulate it. Explicitly, Miles came from middle-class stability. Louis came from poverty so severe that his childhood was defined by hustle and survival. Miles could afford the politics of refusal because he'd never experienced the alternative, had never been in a position where making white people comfortable was the only path out of poverty and danger. Louis's accommodations weren't ideological choices made from a position of security. They were survival strategies developed under conditions Miles had never faced. This class dimension runs through much of the sell-out discourse that surrounded black artists throughout the 20th century. The ability to refuse mainstream accommodation has historically required economic cushioning, educational opportunity, and psychological security that were unevenly distributed. Artists from more privileged backgrounds could afford. The politics of confrontation, artists from poverty often couldn't. Judging Louis Armstrong by standards available to Miles Davis required ignoring the circumstances that made those different standards possible. By the 1960s, the argument had somewhat shifted. Louis's civil rights statements had complicated the Uncle Tom narrative. Miles himself had moved through various stylistic phases and would eventually embrace electric music and rock influences in ways that drew the same sell-out accusations from jazz purists that he'd once leveled at Louis. The irony wasn't lost on those who'd been paying attention. Miles Davis, who had accused Louis Armstrong of compromising for white audiences, would in his electric period be accused of compromising for rock audiences. The cycle of generational accusation continued. Louis Armstrong died in 1971. Miles Davis lived until 1991 and had time to revise his perspective. In his autobiography, published in 1989, Miles was more nuanced about Louis than his 1955 statements had been. He acknowledged Louis's innovations, acknowledged the historical conditions Louis had navigated, acknowledged that the dismissiveness of the 1950s critique had missed important things. It wasn't a full retraction. But it was a recognition that simple judgments about complex people in complex circumstances are usually wrong in some important way. The debate between Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis was never really resolved. It couldn't be resolved because it wasn't about facts. It was about values, about what black artists owe their community and their art, about whether mainstream success is compatible with authentic blackness, about whether the smile is armor or capitulation, about whether surviving in the belly of the beast by playing the beast's game is pragmatic wisdom or moral failure. These questions don't have clean answers, which is precisely why they're still being asked in 2026. Contemporary debates about black artists and mainstream appeal, about selling out versus buying in, about authenticity and compromise and the politics of representation, are all downstream from the Louis Miles argument of the 1950s. Every time a black artist is accused of making music that's too mainstream, or celebrated for refusing to code switch, or criticized for not being political enough, or praised for their crossover success, the ghost of this argument is present. The specific terms have updated, but the underlying tension is the same. What Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis were both right about: racism required black artists to make impossible choices. What they disagreed about was which impossible choice was more defensible. Louis chose accessibility and its costs. Miles chose confrontation and its costs. Neither path was free. Neither man escaped the conditions that made the choice necessary in the first place. And both left legacies so enormous that the argument about what they represent has outlasted both of them by decades. Miles Davis called Louis Armstrong an Uncle Tom in 1955. Louis Armstrong's actual life complicated that verdict immediately and thoroughly. And in 2026, 7 decades later, we're still arguing about whether Louis was right or Miles was right, which is perhaps the best evidence that both were touching something real. The questions they were asking have not been resolved, they've just been updated. The music, though, the music from both of them is indisputably permanently, gloriously right. Whatever their politics, whatever their strategies, whatever their failures and compromises and courageous stands, Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis each made music that stands among the greatest art America has ever produced. And maybe that's the answer, or at least one answer, in the music. They were both free, completely, unapologetically, undeniably free, which was, in the end, all either of them had ever wanted.